I've noticed something interesting about the way people try to save money. Many folks will spend 20 minutes driving across town to save $10 on groceries and then casually make a decision that costs them $10,000 later on. It's a bit like stepping over a $100 bill to pick up a dime. Economically creative, you might say. Over the years, I've realized that most financial mistakes don't come from spending too much money. They come from saving money in the wrong places. People think the path to wealth is simply cutting expenses. Cheaper food, cheaper tools, cheaper advice, cheaper everything. But being cheap and being smart with money are two very different skills. The difference between people who struggle financially and people who build real wealth often comes down to one simple habit. Some people focus on minimizing every dollar they spend. Others focus on where each dollar will create the most value over time. The goal, after all, isn't to spend less money. The goal is to spend wisely. And through a lot of observation, few mistakes, and many years watching how money actually works in the real world, there are 7 things I've learned are simply not worth being cheap about. In fact, trying to save money on them can quietly cost you far more in the long run. The first thing I stopped trying to save money on is knowledge. And that might sound a little strange because we live in a world where people are very proud of learning things for free. Free videos, free articles, free advice from someone's cousin who once read half a business book. It's a wonderful system if your goal is to spend as much time as possible figuring things out the slow way. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with free information. I've spent a good portion of my life reading things that didn't cost a dime. But here's the part people often miss. Free information usually costs something far more valuable than money. It costs time, and time is the most expensive currency you will ever spend. Think about it this way. Imagine you want to learn Spanish. You could spend the next 3 years bouncing between random apps, half-finished lessons, and YouTube videos filmed in someone's kitchen. Eventually, you might get there. Or you could spend a few hundred on a great teacher and compress that journey into a fraction of the time. The same thing happens with cooking, business, investing, almost any skill that matters. People hesitate to pay for knowledge because they see the price tag. They see $500 for a course or a mentor and think that's expensive, but they rarely do the math that actually matters. If learning that skill helps you earn an extra $10,000 a year, then paying $500 to learn it isn't an expense. It's one of the best bargains you'll ever make. What fascinates me is that people will happily spend thousands on a car upgrade they don't need, but suddenly become extremely frugal when it comes to upgrading their own mind. And that's a curious strategy because the most valuable asset you will ever own isn't your house, your portfolio, or your car. It's the knowledge sitting between your ears. The second thing I've learned not to be cheap about is milestone memories. Now, this one surprises people, especially those who are very proud of their spreadsheets and budgeting apps. Somewhere along the way, many people start treating money like the final score of life, as if the goal is simply to die with the highest number in the account. But money was never meant to be the point. It's just a tool. And like any tool, its value depends on what you build with it. Over time, I've noticed that the moments people remember most aren't the days they successfully saved a little extra on groceries. Nobody sits around 20 years later saying, "You remember that incredible Tuesday when I bought the cheaper laundry detergent?" That story rarely makes it to family reunions. What people do remember are milestone moments. A wedding where everyone you care about is in the same room. A birthday that brings old friends together. A graduation that represents years of effort finally paying off. A family reunion where 3 generations sit at the same table and laugh about stories that probably shouldn't be repeated in public. Those moments matter because they don't happen very often. In fact, some of them happen exactly once in your entire life. Now, that doesn't mean being reckless with money. Spending wisely still applies, but trying to squeeze every dollar out of life can sometimes squeeze the meaning out of it too. When you look back years from now, you won't remember most of the things you bought, but you will remember the moments that brought people together. And here's the interesting part. Money can be earned again. Opportunities can come back. Markets can recover. But certain moments in life have a very strict investment policy. They only happen once. The third thing I've learned not to be cheap about is health. And I like to think about it using a very simple idea. Imagine someone gives you a car and tells you it's the only car you will ever own for the rest of your life. No upgrades, no replacements, no trading it in for a newer model later. Just one car forever. Most people would suddenly become excellent mechanics. They'd change the oil on time. They'd pay attention to every strange noise. They wouldn't skip maintenance to save a few dollars because they'd understand something very important. If that car breaks down, they're walking for the rest of their lives. Well, the human body works under a very similar policy. You only get one. And yet, people will try to save money in the strangest ways. They'll happily buy the cheapest food available, skip sleep like it's an optional hobby, and treat exercise as something that only happens when New Year's resolutions are still fresh. The truth is that three things quietly determine a large part of how well your life works: sleep, nutrition, and movement. I like to think of them as a simple triangle. If one side collapses, the whole structure starts wobbling. Good sleep sharpens your thinking. Proper nutrition fuels your body. Regular movement keeps the whole system running the way it was designed to run. None of these things are particularly glamorous, which is probably why they're often ignored. And here's the interesting part. Investing a little more in these areas often produces remarkable returns. Better food, proper medical care, maybe a gym membership you actually use instead of just paying for out of guilt. That's a pretty attractive return on investment. Another place where trying to be too cheap can quietly hold people back is the tools they use to do their work. Now, in the beginning, being scrappy makes perfect sense. When you're just starting something new, you don't need the fanciest equipment in the world. In fact, sometimes the simplest setup is the best teacher. It forces you to focus on the fundamentals instead of hiding behind expensive gear. But there comes a point when the very tools that helped you get started begin to limit how far you can go. I've seen this happen in almost every field. Someone begins with the basics, learns the craft, improves their skills, and eventually their output starts bumping into the ceiling of their equipment. The computer is too slow. The microphone makes everything sound like it was recorded inside a soup can. The camera struggles every time the lighting changes. The software takes twice as long to do something that should take 5 minutes. At that stage, continuing to save money on tools can become surprisingly expensive. Think about it logically. If a better computer saves you an hour a day, that's roughly 365 hours a year. Even if your time were worth only a modest amount, that improvement quickly pays for itself. And most of the time, your time is worth a great deal more than you think. The same applies to microphones, cameras, software, or any equipment that directly affects the quality and speed of your work. A good tool doesn't magically create success, but it removes friction. It allows skill and effort to translate into results more efficiently. In investing, we often talk about buying productive assets, things that generate value over time. Well, sometimes the most productive asset you can buy isn't a stock or a business. Sometimes it's simply a better tool that allows you to do your work twice as well and twice as fast. And another area where trying to save a little money can become very expensive is safety and security. This isn't the most exciting topic in the world, which is probably why people like to ignore it. Nobody wakes up in the morning excited to buy insurance or install a security system. It's not glamorous. It doesn't make for great dinner conversation, but it matters more than most people realize. In investing, one of the first principles is very simple: protect the downside. You can spend years building wealth, making good decisions, saving consistently, investing patiently, but a single large mistake or one unfortunate event without protection can erase a surprising amount of that progress. Think about something as simple as insurance. Many people look at the annual cost and think, I'll skip it and save the money. It feels like a clever little victory until the day something actually goes wrong. Suddenly the small amount you saved each year doesn't look so impressive compared to the size of the loan. The same logic applies to protecting valuable items or important assets. If you own something meaningful, whether it's sentimental jewelry, important documents, or valuable equipment, securing it properly is not paranoia. It's basic risk management. A safe deposit box, a proper safe at home, or a reliable security system might cost a few hundred a year. On paper, that can look like an unnecessary expense. But when you compare that cost to the potential loss of something irreplaceable, all the math becomes very straightforward. The reality is that life occasionally throws unpleasant surprises at everyone. That's part of the deal. Spending a little money to reduce the damage from those surprises is not wasteful. It's intelligent, because the goal isn't just to build wealth over time. The goal is to make sure one bad day doesn't wipe out 10 good years. Another thing I've learned not to be cheap about is hiring professionals. Now, this one can be difficult for people, especially when they're starting something new. There's a natural temptation to do everything yourself. After all, how hard could it be? There's probably a tutorial somewhere on the internet. And if you watch enough videos at 2 in the morning, eventually you might convince yourself you've become an expert. Unfortunately, the world doesn't always reward that level of confidence. There's a concept I've always liked called staying within your circle of competence. It simply means understanding what you truly know well, and just as importantly, recognizing where your knowledge ends. Most financial mistakes happen when people wander far outside that circle while feeling completely certain they're still in the middle of it. This becomes especially dangerous in areas like law, taxes, or complex financial decisions. These are fields where small details matter enormously. A single clause in a contract or a single tax rule you didn't know existed can change the outcome by thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. I've seen situations where someone paid few $100s for a consultation with a good tax advisor and saved tens of thousands in taxes simply because that advisor understood the system better. That's not an expense. That's an extraordinary return on investment. The same logic applies to lawyers, accountants, or specialists in their respective fields. These people spend years learning the details so you don't have to learn them the hard way. Now, of course, you shouldn't hire professionals for every tiny decision in life, but when the stakes are meaningful and the topic sits outside your expertise, paying for good advice can be one of the smartest financial moves you make. Because the truth is, mistakes are always more expensive than advice. The final area where trying to be too frugal can quietly hurt you is retirement investing. And the reason is simple. When it comes to investing, time is not just helpful. Time is the entire engine that makes the system work. Most people understand the idea of compound interest in theory. They hear that money can grow on top of money year after year, but the real magic of compounding doesn't show up in the first few years. In fact, in the beginning, it looks almost disappointingly slow. That's usually the moment when people decide they have plenty of time and can start investing later. Later, unfortunately, is where the math becomes unforgiving. Imagine two people who both plan to invest for retirement. One starts early and lets their investments compound for decades. The other waits 10 or 15 years because there are always more exciting things to spend money on today. A nicer car, a bigger apartment, a few more vacations that seemed extremely important at the time. By the time the second person finally starts investing, they're no longer racing the market. They're racing the clock. One of the most reliable principles in investing is that time in the market beats trying to perfectly time the market. You don't need to predict every rise and fall. You simply need to start early and allow compounding to quietly do its job. Each dollar invested today has far more time to multiply than a dollar invested 10 years from now. And that difference may not look dramatic in the first decade, but over several decades, it becomes enormous. In other words, the earlier you begin, the less you actually have to invest to reach the same destination. That's why treating retirement investing as something you'll figure out later can be one of the most expensive forms of procrastination ever invented, because compounding rewards patience. But it only works for those who give it enough time. When you step back and look at all of this, a simple pattern begins to appear. Money isn't meant to be protected from every possible expense. If that were the goal, the safest strategy would be to lock it in a vault and never touch it again. Unfortunately, that strategy produces a very large vault and a very small life. The real purpose of money is much simpler. It's a tool, and like any tool, it should be used to build something that matters used wisely. Money buys time. It buys opportunities to learn faster. It buys the ability to protect yourself from setbacks. It buys the tools that allow you to do better work. It buys advice from people who understand things you haven't yet mastered. And it buys the ability to invest early enough for compound interest to quietly work its magic over decades. Along the way, it can also buy something that spreadsheets often forget to measure: moments with the people who matter most. What the people who matter most, what they should stop trying to save every dollar. I usually think about the same 7 areas we've talked: knowledge, meaningful memories, your health, the tools you rely on, your safety and security, good professional advice, and long-term investing for the future. These aren't places where being cheap makes you wealthy. In many cases, being cheap here makes life more expensive later. Now, I'm curious about something. In your own life, what's one thing you eventually stopped being cheap about and realized it was one of the best decisions you ever are